Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to have you here today. We'll give everyone just about a minute or two to get in and get settled. So, as you're joining us, we'd love to hear where you're coming from, maybe what the weather's like where you are. Your favorite ARMA memory, whatever you want to share in the chat with us. We're happy to hear it. You can believe 2023 is almost over. I can't believe we're almost to the end. The years just keep speeding up, I think. I see some coming from all over. Ozarks, Missouri, you're right close to where Russ and I are. Kansas City and St. Louis. Well, there's a Canada, Amalia, but opposite side. Lots of Canada. I bet it's getting cold and snowy in Canada.
Columbia.
Yeah, look at all these people close to us, Russ.
Yeah.
Atlanta, Syracuse. We're starting to get to the point where we're going to be jealous of anyone who posts it's nice and sunny and warm, because those of us in the Midwest or North are getting to our gray, gloomy days of when it's cold and we just want to see the sun. So Mark from Arizona, we're going to be jealous of you in just a few weeks, I feel like. All right. Well, it looks like we've got a pretty good crowd, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar today, Privacy-Driven Records and Governance, Leading the Conversation. I've got Russ Cottle and Amalia Barthel here with us today. So thank you for joining us. Russ, if you want to jump to the next page.
Yep, there we go.
There we go. I am Jennifer Millett. I am the Vice President of Event Strategy and Partnerships here at ARMA. And I'm so glad you've joined us. If you are an ARMA member, thank you so much for being with us today and taking advantage of your membership. If you haven't, checked out the new Hire Logic platform and communities on arma.org, we highly encourage you to do that. It's a great place to connect and continue networking outside of our events. And then for those new or old, we do host a ARMA overview webinar the first Wednesday of every month. So December 6th coming up. And this is just a great opportunity to see, what your ARMA membership has to offer. Make sure you're utilizing all your benefits that are available to you. And if you're not an ARMA member, please join us. See what we have to offer, all the great things that this community brings and can bring to you in the form of education and content and more webinars like today's and our amazing events. So check out arma.org to learn more, or we'll see you on December 6th. Let's go ahead. And then everyone's kind of housekeeping items and then burning questions. We will be sending a copy of today's session and a recording of today's session, as well as your IGP credits in an email about 24 to 48 hours after today's webinar. So keep an eye on your inbox. A couple more housekeeping items. If you've got a question for Russ or Amalia today, please put that in the Q&A box. The chat, we hope, is lively and conversational today, and sometimes questions can get lost in there. So pop them into the Q&A chat for our hosts, and we'll make sure they get to them as best we can through today's content. And again, if you have any questions about the recording or your CEU credits, feel free to reach out to ARMA or to education@armaintl.org. And big announcement, registration for InfoNext, ARMA's new conference that we collaborated with the previous MER conference, is coming April 8th through 10th in beautiful Palm Springs. So when all of us Northerners and Midwesterners are tired of the gloom, we can escape to beautiful Palm Springs to experience this new kind of future thinking conference that we're bringing to you. Registration's opening soon, maybe tomorrow. So again, keep an eye on your inbox for more information about registration. But this is really the place for people to come together and talk about things that are coming, things that are going to impact our industry, how to react, how to be prepared, and how to make plans for everything that's going to impact the information governance profession, here in the near term and in the far future. So keep an eye and join us in Palm Springs. And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much to our sponsor, Xtero. It's because of our partners that we get to bring you content like this today. And we hope that when you're thinking of a product or a service for your organization, you support the organizations that support you. And so with that, I will turn it over to Russ and Amalia to kick it off.
All right, thank you everybody for attending. And you are here for privacy-driven records and governance, leading the conversation. So first we'll do some introductions, and then I will walk through the agenda and how we're going to attack this today. So Amalia, you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure, I can do that. Thank you, Russ. I mean, what you see is what you get. I'm a passionate privacy advocate, risk management, privacy, cybersecurity, but I'm also an educator. I have created and teach courses at the University of Toronto, a School of Continuing Studies, and I am a senior privacy advisor with Xtero, supporting organizations that are using our tools to wrap governance and improve their privacy posture.
Yeah, and my name is Russ Cottle. I'm a regional vice president here at Xtero. I actually started in the records and information management business back in 1997, so about 25 years of experience. Started with the paper records aspect of things, and then gradually as the world changed to more electronic format, started focusing more on the electronic side of things, and then data privacy as it relates to records and information governance. My history actually started with a company called Jordan Lawrence that some of you may have heard before. And then we were acquired by Xtero in 2019, and I've been able to stick on and really grow as a learner of information governance as we see that there's so many intersections of records and information management and data privacy and e-discovery, and it's all under this legal GRC umbrella that we're all focused on now. And so information governance is this giant umbrella that's covering it. So for the agenda today, we covered the introductions. We're going to ask a quick poll after I get through the agenda slide here, just kind of get an idea of where people are with their records retention programs. And then we're going to dive into some things a little more specific about what are some of the challenges in privacy that directly relate to records management. What are some of the how do you integrate the privacy initiatives around it as well? And we'll specifically talk about some of the laws and regulations that are out there, and then we'll go through some of the different requirements, navigating privacy and retention to limit penalties, how you manage this appropriately, and then what are some actionable insights on a go-forward basis. And then we'll have a poll question after that at the end, and then open up for Q&A. So to start, let's start with the poll. So just kind of curious, on a scale of 1 through 5, how confident that your privacy program and records management program are working synergistically? Great feedback. Oh, already at 100 respondents already, 65%. That's great. Get up maybe up to 75. Can we get to 75%? Oh, we're inching. One more and we'll get us there, I think. Perfect. All right. Can we and then I can end this, and then it will then hopefully pop up, correct? Share results. There we go. All right. Did everybody see that? I think I can see it. Amalia, is that sharing for everybody?
I see it.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah. So
it looks like a bell curve in some respects, if you put up here, which actually makes a lot of sense. There's a group that maybe there's some improvement that can be made, and maybe we can learn some things from some of the groups that are pretty confident in the way that they built this out. But typically we see they're all here in the middle, because I think privacy programs are becoming more and more important, but it's just a matter of getting everybody on board within your organization to understand where these relate. And so, as I mentioned before, Xtero, comes to you as kind of a platform where we deal with information governance, cybersecurity, digital forensics, e-discovery practices. But privacy is really something that we're seeing, because there's a lot of overlap when it comes to privacy. There's a lot of overlap when it comes to e-discovery. You have to understand where your data is. You have to know how you're using that data, and you have to be able to get to that data quickly and efficiently to meet whatever requirements are out there. And so to get started here, we're going to start with privacy imperatives. The privacy imperatives, and I want to give you guys some background on this. There are a couple different studies or surveys that were done that we wanted to share just some results. My bet is many of us are, in the records management space. We may report into a legal organization or compliance side of the organization. We may report into IT now as well. But this executive it's imperative based on the CLO survey that executive sponsorship and a cross-functional team need to be involved because they will help move things forward for you. This survey specifically asked CLOs, what were some of the concerns on a scale of 1 to 10? What are some of the concerns that you guys are most worried about? And look at what we've got here, broken out. It's cybersecurity, regulations and compliance, and data privacy. All of those relate to information governance, understanding where your information is. There's a lot that could be covered under regulations and compliance, but let's really think about what we're seeing in the industry now. We're seeing so many laws and regulations pop up about privacy. We're seeing so many different aspects of organizations trying to understand where their data is so that they're managing it appropriately. And that's where the records management functionality comes in. And that's really where we need to see that aspect of the organizations grow. They're also concerned about, and the reason for this is because over retention. As I mentioned before, I got started in this space when it was paper records. It was really easy to go in and give a analogy or show somebody a giant warehouse full of boxes and say, do you think you need to keep all these? Maybe we can help you get rid of 30% of them or 50% of them. That was huge. People thought, wow, that's great. So that was a really big initiative for organizations. And then electronic records came about. And then we were able to say, whoa, storage is expensive. You shouldn't be, maintaining everything forever. You need to apply retention to this. And then storage started getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And then it became, well, really, why would I go through the hassle of trying to eliminate this legacy data when it's not that expensive to store? And maybe someday I'll need it actually. Well, over the last 5-6 years, I think what we've found now is that there is a new risk. It's not a cost risk, but there is a new risk that in keeping everything forever. You have to worry about data breaches. You have to worry about ransom attacks. What sort of enforcement actions from different regulating authorities? What if you have a litigation? I mean, that was the thing that was scary back in 2006, right? Or even before that, 2002, when e-discovery really started, popping off. Ooh, where were the backup tapes? They were in this closet. We didn't know that. Oh, it's spoliation. You got to worry about all of these different things. And then one that I don't even have on here that is a key risk. But if you have any of these risks that pop up, what's that do to your brand recognition? What does that do to your customer base? Then there's a chance that there could be revenue loss specifically around that. So Amalia, I'm going to kind of hand it over this slide just very closely because I think with your background in privacy, I think that what you have experienced this with many, many organizations, but do you want to touch on just the idea of what's visible generally and then how over retention really is an unknown concern?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few underlying risks to what you have seen before. So until we get to a cybersecurity breach, until we get to a ransomware attack, we actually there's a big turnover of staff in organizations. So they don't necessarily, I don't remember a job where I had the next person coming and saying, hey, let me hand over all this stuff to you. Let me explain to you everything that I've documented and where it is. So what tends to happen is information tends to be left in different corners and it's just sitting there because there's a couple of issues. There is no handover. There is no understanding of the value of the data. So if I'm not going to use it today or tomorrow, I have no idea why I should use it or when I'm going to use it. But also one of the things that we are concerned in privacy with is ownership, because we have to demonstrate accountability. So it's in the law that says, organizations need to demonstrate accountability over collection, use, retention, and disposal of personal information. So most companies, they only see, just like here, the tip of the iceberg of the information that they currently work with, because after the pandemic, I don't know what happened, but everything exploded in terms of how much information is thrown at us. So who has two brains? I mean, I don't, some days I barely have a full brain. So we are overwhelmed. We are surrounded by information. We're bombarded with information. We can't classify it fast enough because it becomes obsolete. So there's just a ton of stuff underneath that iceberg.
Absolutely. And I think that it ties right into what you had mentioned too, Amalia, is that, over retention, and this is where records management comes in. Over retention is a huge risk. And some of these risks are, data breaches. So for you guys, as an individual trying to build a records program within an organization, leverage these privacy trends, leverage these risks from a privacy perspective so that you can get executive buy-in, so that you can then quantify some of these reasons as to why we don't need to maintain everything forever. There's a lot of talk about redundant, obsolete, trivial information, but there's also a lot of talk about just information that you're collecting and not knowing why you're collecting.
Exactly, not knowing the value of it. And I like a comment that we received from someone here saying, my main client is really driving their privacy program, enhance the records retention management program and data minimization through the lens of brand and customer trust, more so than compliance. Oh. I mean, that's ideal. But I want to say that all the clients that we're serving and we've talked, Extero talks to, it's privacy who's driving the records management function, because in privacy, we need to put a limitation on the use, retention, and also have a purpose for each set of personal information that we're using.
Agreed. All right. So why is this so important? And many of you may be familiar with this in the information governance reference model. I love this idea, and I was actually at InfoGov World a couple of weeks ago, and they talk about the umbrella, right? The umbrella. So information governance is this umbrella that covers so many different aspects of your organization. And I think that if you just take RIM by itself and try to go and tackle that one initiative, you're going to get to a certain point, but you're not going to be encompassing these other groups. And so you really need to leverage as much as the organization as you can to build these out. And because as Amalia said, what we're running into, best practices and trends and seeing in the industry, is that there is a cross-functional team, generally including privacy, generally including legal or e-discovery, IT and IT security are also involved in this. And we need to make sure as records management professionals that we are in that conversation as well, because at the end of the day, I think over retention is our biggest challenge, and having the records and information management group involved in this could be the biggest benefit for that particular project that's going on.
Yeah, and another thing here that I see, and I love that it's in red, is that this disposal. How many clients do I talk to? And I have an IT background, so I came into privacy from that angle, from the technical angle, and the IT shops, they don't know how to safely dispose. They don't know what that means. They don't have a playbook. They don't have a process document. They are waiting for someone to give them the green light to say, click the red button and destroy this information, because they don't want to take that risk. So that's where it really gets stuck, in that dispose box.
Absolutely. And we talk a lot about, defensible disposition, right? What's the best way to go through this? And a lot of it is a decision matrix, right? Make sure that you can go through and document what your decisions were around this process, and then be consistent with how you actually go and enforce those decisions. I had a general counsel years ago tell me, because records management, there's lots of different laws and regulations that may be out there, right? But what that general counsel said was, I would, and I probably said this on other ARMA sessions that I've talked about. He said, Russ, it's a lot easier to defend consistency than it is inconsistency. So I'd rather be consistently wrong than inconsistently right. And so first and foremost, I mean, 30% might actually be low, but if you can work with your IT, the legal compliance groups to determine, okay, if we can identify that something is redundant, a duplicate, let's go and eliminate that data after a certain period of time. If we can identify that this document or these business records are obsolete, meaning it's from a product that we had 30 years ago, and we have no statute of limitations to maintain that information, or it's from employees that are no longer with the company and it's been 15 years. What are some rules that we can put in place to, determine
lighten the load?
Yeah, exactly. Lighten the load. And then trivial. I remember this is an old box inventory story, but I can remember doing physical inventories for clients and then pulling open boxes of marketing material. But it was marketing material that was like hundreds of thousands of pages and boxes of marketing material that was probably saved somewhere else, but they kept multiple copies of this. So it was trivial information at that point. So make sure that we are going through this, and to do this, how do we approach all this? And so this is kind of the data retention workflow that I like to walk organizations through. What is this defensible decision-making process? First and foremost, it's the records inventory or data inventory. Depending on what vendor or person you're talking to, it's going to be called one of those that's around there. But in this process, you have to understand, and actually I was on another presentation, I actually like the analogy better. It's the what records we have, who has access to those records, why we have these records, where we're storing those records, and then finally at the end of it is, the last, how are we going to dispose of this information? So
but I like Ross that you're talking about records inventory, because when organizations think about records, that means that they have organized data into an intelligent form that will give them value. When you have a record, you have it for a reason. You're doing something or benefiting in some way from that record, but you also can analyze that record to understand what is the data that I have. What am I going to do with it? What are the legal issues, implications on how I need to protect it or who I need to share with, etc. So having ourselves organized in a records inventory is much more valuable than a data inventory. The data inventory is before. So much more valuable to have records and to understand who owns those records, who needs those records in the business.
Absolutely. And I used to tell a story too. I've never seen a regulation out there that has said, oh, you need to keep social security numbers for this amount of time, right? That's a data type that you need to protect. But social security number, if it's a part of an employee personnel file, you need to keep it because it's an employee personnel file for a certain period of time, or you need to keep it because it's part of the driver's license records or whatever that may be. So I appreciate you noting that too, Amalia, because I do think that there is a difference between a data inventory and a records inventory. A records inventory can be more focused on the business, and it will allow you to apply those regulatory requirements. And so that really becomes the next step, right? First, understand your records, then look and apply appropriate retention standards. It can be based on global or US or state requirements. It can be based on industry best practices. It could be based on business needs that are out there, and then apply that to your records and ensuring that you have this managed and you update it on an annual basis and what frequency it is, and then tie it to your paper records, tie it to your people, and then tie it to your data sources, the end data sources of where this data actually is located. Amalia, I know part of this too that we've talked through is that, with data retention, there are requirements to hold on to this information too, right? And so if there are any sort of legal hold obligations, or if there's any sort of investigations going on, you make sure you have your act together around those processes as well, right?
Yes, sorry, I saw a great question and I was kind of listening to you, but yes, correct. So somebody made the distinction here that the slide is called data retention, but we talk about records retention, and is it synonymous? And I want to say, kind of back to where I started, you first start with data discovery. It's like, what's flying around in my organization? What are all the data types? Then you need to look at it from a record perspective, just because it has to make sense. If I have different kinds of data elements and I put them together, they don't give me any value. I can't do anything with them. I also cannot put ownership on those. So I organize the data into records, and then I can apply rules. That's why we talk about records retention more so than data retention, because data retention is that rot. Data retention is disorganized and chaotic. Records retention is where we put our legislation hat on, the global, we need to be accountable, put some owners to it, really understand what the business is doing with it so we can have governance around that, so we can make the data available when they need it, not, you know, keep them stuck somewhere like in the Zoom room when you wait for someone to admit you. So all of these things show that when you are getting to the records and you classify data and records, you're in a more mature position already.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I want to show next kind of just an example of, you know, the differences, right, in a data inventory versus a records inventory, right? And so there are things in a records inventory, just you need to understand. So this is an example of the records. Employee onboarding, right? You need to understand, you know, possibly to help with some of the privacy requirements, the data subjects. Who's this information about? Right? What jurisdictions am I in? What sort of personal data do I have? How am I collecting this data and managing this data? What applications may be present or maybe storing some of this, who has access to it and owns this information. And again, some additional locations, is it stored off of these applications into other repositories or third parties? And then understand what your retention requirements are around it as well. Understanding this piece of it is more of the privacy side of it, but to know the record and know the retention obligations is a foundation for records management as well as just data management in general. And so on this one, so Amali, I know data inventories, as we've talked about, can be a project that's never completed at many organizations. And that's just because organizations change, right? You know, but what I was going to say, what have you seen organizations do that has been to make this more efficient for their organizations?
Well, I mean, one of the things that it's a misconception, so I'm going to answer your question with a negative, is to put this on the privacy people or on the records people. Say, no, you got to figure this out. Well, the records management people as well as the privacy people can only answer to what are the regulations, what are the rules that exist for those particular types of record types, but they cannot tell you or make you do anything. They're not the custodian. They don't get value out of that data. So also it's a misconception to put it on IT. So, and it's interesting because we're talking about how can the privacy people understand the records people, the records management people, and vice versa. But I think there are two, you know, if you think of a RACI chart, the responsible, accountable, informed, and consulted, I think both should be consulted, and the business should be the one really understanding what they are supposed to be doing with those records, why those records exist, what kind of value, what kind of profit they're going to get out of that, what kind of value they're getting out of that, what kind of brand reputation, etc. Because in the end, it's the business that gains out of this. We're just there to help them understand the rules so they can work with those records effectively and get the most value.
Yeah, great point. One of the things when I'm asked, like, what's the hardest part about implementing a records and information management program? My part is, I always say it's changing people's habits. That is truly the hardest part of this. And so communication is key. Yeah, making it simple and straightforward for folks. I mean, I know in my role on a day-to-day basis at Xtero, I've got a laundry list of things and emails that are coming in all the time that I'm trying to accomplish, and then add records management on top of it. That's a big challenge. So how do we make it simple? How do we make it straightforward? How do we make it easy for the business to comply and take advantage of it? All right, now this is going to be a lot of Amalia talking, because there are a ton of privacy challenges. And Amalia, you have been doing this for years, and you have a really great understanding of the complexity of just some of the laws and regulations that an organization has to cover. And so, we'll start at the high level, the global aspect of things, and then work our way down. So
Yeah.
So go ahead, Amalia, just walking through just kind of the global issues that are popping up now with privacy that have some minimum and maximum retention requirements associated with the type of data that you're collecting.
Yeah. So, I mean, so those are the top questions for every client that we work with. But can you give me a list of like, and we go, yeah, but can you tell me what you're going to use it for? Right. So, if you're in the insurance industry, you buy personal insurance, life insurance, etc. Those records may need to exist forever until you no longer have a policy, which means you've died or somebody cashed in the policy for you. There are other records that particularly that they contain personal information that you may not need to keep past 2 years, for example. Let me just give you a silly example. As much as Amazon likes reviews and such, there is a limited amount of time that review is good for, because even those products, unless it's I don't know, thread, they get obsolete. So if I put a comment there, they are taking my personal information and my comment, and they are hoping that there's going to be more sales out of that. But the thing is that even that comment is obsolete in maximum 2 years, right? So, and again, for us in privacy, retention is really stops at the limited with the purpose. So, if we have exceeded the purpose for which we needed to use, because we got consent or there's a legitimate interest to obtain that data, to collect it and provide some value out of it to the consumer or employee and to the business, after a certain period of time, if that purpose justification doesn't exist anymore, we kind of have to say, oh, we need to cut off, right? That's when records retention and records management take over, because they may say, wait, there's some other conditions and other rules out there and laws that we need to abide by, such as taxation. We need to prove, that we're doing business in a certain way, ethics, anti-bribery, corruption, whatever you have, that we have to keep data for longer. So I don't know if I answered but there's laws popping up every day with more and more, requirements for us to keep in mind.
Well, and I'd like to pull this together with records retention. Some of you that have been in this industry a long time, remember when there weren't that many records retention laws that were out there. If we're going back to the 70s, there were some that were requirements are out there and so on. And then we come into the 80s and it's starting to get a little bit more. There was different, GLBAs and HIPAA requirements and all that had retention tied to it. And then we started seeing more and more governments getting in and adding some things to it. I know this in our space, right? You can talk to different vendors that provide records retention research. You can talk to some that'll say they have 280,000 different records retention requirements for organizations. You can have some that say there's 80,000, and there's a law in South Carolina that is related to ferret breeding records. And so you have to retain those for, I think, 7 years or something along those lines. But how many organizations on this call actually breed ferrets, right? It's not a requirement for us because we're not in that business, but there's so many different laws and requirements, and privacy is coming to that same forefront. Privacy is probably 30 plus years behind where records management was. But it's growing quicker and faster because it has a more direct effect on the consumer that most organizations, consumers and employees for that matter. So here's just some examples. This one we got from the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Just an update. This is back in August. It probably has changed since then. But there are laws and regulations popping up all over the U.S. We already did the globe aspect of things, and then some of the consumer rights and obligations across different states. And then Amalia, can you speak specifically to the fact that the retention, if you have this information and people are requesting this information, there's an obligation for the organization, right?
Right. So that's the other side of the coin, right? But it can be justified that you have to keep this information. The whole idea is to actually know that has been justified, documented, and you are allowed to keep it. And then depending on how the data was obtained, and there's certain rights that don't apply to all of the lawful collection of information, in terms of, you know, if you give it consent, you have certain rights, whether there's legitimate interest, you have other rights, maybe less. The point is that you have to produce the information. So if they have the right to access their information, look at all the checkpoints, check marks, and that's just in the United States. But now that you have, you know, GDPR and you have other laws, it becomes it's a bit of a maze to go through. But imagine that you would have to contend with a lot more laws around the world. So you have to know, where is this data? Do they have the right to access it? Do they have the right to obtain confirmation that data is being processed? How do I even produce that to them, to say, yeah, you know, data is processed in here, here, and here? Do they have the right to object? And how do you actually enable that? How do you make that happen? I object. Okay, great. We take a picture of your hand, but how do I make that happen into operations, right? How do I put a flag on that record or those records to say, okay, there's been an objection here because of these data elements, these records can no longer be processed. So there's a lot to think about, but all of these laws that are now starting to be passed or bills that are passed into law, they seem to start to align on a lot of these rights. So
Yep. Go ahead.
If you have to keep the data, you have to produce it and you have to defend it while you keep it. If you don't keep the data, you don't have headaches. So, of course, sometimes you have to keep the data. Yes.
Yeah, well, and I liken it to, you know, e-discovery or discovery. I don't know why we call it e-discovery, because it's paper or electronic nowadays, right? But discovery back in the early 2000s, if you had that data, you needed to produce that data if it was somewhat relevant to that. If you had implemented records retention programs in place and you no longer had that data because of appropriate consistent retention rules, then you didn't have to produce it because you don't have that data anymore. And I think the same thing can be done in this consumer rights aspect. So if you do have requirements in your organization where you're deleting customer data, like I was just thinking, when Amalia, when you were giving the example of Amazon, a couple months ago, I went into my Amazon orders and was like, what was that thing I ordered? And I went back like 3 years looking at what I was like, oh, that's what that was. It just made me think, wow, they still have that. So if I requested from the right to delete this, if I was a California resident and wanted them to delete this data, then Amazon, you know, would they say, oh no, you know, we don't have this data, we delete all of our stuff after a certain period of time, or we can't delete this data because we need it for this business purpose, or so on. So having these having a defensible records retention program in place will not only save you from a standpoint of, you know, having this information out there, but also on the responses that you have to do to some of these privacy regulations that are coming up. Data minimization and retention limitations. So this one came from, you know, GDPR. So from a global perspective, you know, Amalia, this actually talks specifically around, you know, retention, in that you have to have it for at least, you know, or you can't have it more than this amount of time, right? And you have to delete them.
You're right. So data minimization refers to the minimum amount and copies of personal information, because also how many data elements do I need to provide this service for this purpose? So that's one aspect of data minimization. But the other aspect is, how many copies do I keep and why am I making so many copies? So that's one issue. But again, there's been a question here that I'm hoping I can address. Yes, privacy has retention limitations simply because personal information is incredibly sensitive in many types of contexts. So we want to make sure that we also protect people's personal information by reducing the time, the duration that we actually have access to it and have it. But that doesn't mean that if the company has other legal obligations, and sometimes it cannot simply be, well, it's a business imperative that we have this data. If it's part of a record and it breaks a chain that has an adverse effect that can be defensible, then that data needs to be continued to be kept. So I know some people find that maybe there may be a conflict between this data minimization so strict and records retention, but it isn't. In fact, it's records management allows us to justify and come back to privacy and go, look, privacy people, don't lose your hair. We still need to keep this data because, and that because is very, very important, right? But this is how in privacy laws, we basically protect people's personal information by putting a limitation on the amount of data and the time that we keep it.
Exactly. All right, now we're going to jump in and talk about some, if we're going to get there we go, some actionable insights. And really it starts, and again, data inventory, records inventory, we kind of are using these synonymously, even though there is a difference, right? I think a data inventory is a good first step for most organizations because it's going to help.
We have to discover what they don't know, what's in every pocket. Yeah.
And there's multiple ways to do this now, right? There are ways, some people may be, doing a manual approach to where you're leveraging Excel spreadsheets and you're going on interviewing individuals throughout your organization. But it goes back to that initial, slide that I'd shown earlier, where it's understanding what data you have, how you're leveraging this data, why you're processing this data, who has access to it, what systems are out there, and so on. There's also advantages now too, to where you can leverage a data discovery tool that will be able to go and scan different environments and leverage AI or leverage technology to determine the volume or the type of data that is actually being collected in these different repositories. So there's a number of different gaps. So it's the asset inventory, understanding what systems and applications you're using, the processing inventory, which is more the data, like what type of data and why am I processing this data, and then the records inventory, that is more of the business use, the business record aspect of it, and how those regulations tie to it. So that is, again, breaking it down. Here's, you can take pieces of each of those different types of inventories to build in and determine what your records inventory is of employee onboarding. The second step, and I'll hand off here, Amala, when we think about the second step, so once you've understood and have the business records and the idea of what departments and what their business needs are around it, the next step is the retention schedule. Right.
So the next thing is to really understand what that record is used for, because I'm feeling the pain of the records management people and managers, because a privacy comes in and says, oh, you need to have a purpose limitation and a use limitation and all of that. But I think that becomes part of the schedule. So if 3 sets of data are being used to start, let's say you want an insurance policy for your car, that's great, but that becomes part of the policy. The policy record is the one that we need to judge that validity of how long are we going to keep it? How long are we allowed to keep it? And it's not just the 3, the first name, last name, and the social insurance number. We have to look at the whole, because that record without those 3 elements is useless to anyone. So and no law in the world, actually, by the way, says, that thou shalt not retain data no matter what. So what if it's useless? Because then we can't do business at all.
Yeah, and this was just tied in to what you were just talking about here, right? So you can have this data map and understand, I'm processing this type of data, but what business records are associated with that processing? And then how are we going to ultimately manage the retention of it?
Right. And we manage the retention at a record level, even in privacy. we manage it at a record level. We don't manage it at like, I have 3 data elements and I'm going to put a number on them. That's just impossible. That's not something that's useful to anyone. It's not achievable, and it would take us 100 years to do.
Exactly. I did not know that my slide built. So there we go. How about that? And then it's also important to understand too, the global considerations that are out there. Again, a philosophy that we coach and preach and hope people stand by is consistency, and trying to apply this. This is not showing you that, oh, I should go out and employee medical records. I should have 25 different retention periods, and I should follow Norway, or I should follow the longest.
Mm-hmm.
Norway has a 60 year retention on this information. No, it's show that you have done the due diligence, that you have identified what sort of business records you have, what sort of volume and impact you have in these different jurisdictions. And then you looked at all of these and determined what's the best practice for your organization to move forward with how they're maintaining this information.
Right.
Also have a logic behind here, like, okay, tie into the regulations. How is this applied to my organization? You can't necessarily, there are some schedules that we could go to that are kind of the big bucket approach, which actually I'm a fan of, to where there's less granularity in the schedule, so that you can have some consistency, but to have some background into, okay, well, what regulations did I review to actually determine that I go with this 7 for retention and so on.
And don't forget that this is supposed to be an annual exercise. So if this year this record was supposed to be kept for 40 years, but next year something changed and now we can only use it for 5 years, we have to review that every year, and we have to understand the logic behind why are we keeping it less, or why do we need to keep it more. The retention is also fluid, so it's just not gonna be the same. It'll have to be reviewed every year, and it will have to be reviewed in the light of how that records retention period has changed because of a certain law, but also in the light of what is the business doing with it. Maybe the business has decided, we're not going to be in this branch of the business anymore. We're folding that branch of the business. Oh, well, other retention periods kick in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that businesses now change so quickly. The flow of information. Amalia talked about this at the beginning. When COVID hit, like, we were inundated with so much information, inundated with so much data, and it almost feels overwhelming at times. So how do we manage our business retention policies in a cohesive and straightforward manner? We have to be aware of the changing environments that are taking place. New systems, new applications. You may be able to then apply retention to different data sources or different repositories because you've moved data to a new system over here. Instead of moving everything over, it's like when you're moving houses and downsizing, do you take everything that you haven't touched in your basement for the last 30 years to the new place that you're going to? No, you got to go through a cleanup. You need to look at that and determine what is some of the rot that was down in the basement and not bring it all the way over. We saw a lot of that going on when people were migrating from on-prem to cloud solutions, specifically around the Microsoft or Google suite, right? There were people were migrating everything that they had prior and bringing it over. There's a lot of opportunity to clean some of those things up and reduce a lot of the risks that your organization may be having with over retention. And so now we're actually going to jump in and talk a little bit about how do I operationalize this, right? How do I manage this to reduce, you got to reduce a lot of the requirements. There's so much risk by maintaining all of this, but you got to have some defensibility around it. You got to have standard operating procedures associated with it. And technology will absolutely help you. Don't shy away from technology. There are tools out there that can help you manage this. Haven't necessarily found the easy button yet for getting this program and then going through and just wiping out data. It's not there yet, but if you go through these steps, you can absolutely have a documented process to be able to show any regulator or any auditor or anybody that comes in and says, well, how did you manage this process? Why did you go through this? And a lot of it starts with understanding, where your data is, and then applying those retention rules across those different media sources that are out there. And so it could be electronic, it could be paper, it could be on third-party vendor systems. We need to make sure we understand where this is so that we can document it and show how we are managing the retention aspect of things.
Right, so you've got two excellent points. One is we have to show how we're managing it, but the other point is we have to show that we know what are those rules that we're managing. So it's not arbitrary, it's not, that we are actively involved. And I put it on the business. The business needs to understand retention benefits them. It doesn't benefit anyone else. It benefits them to do their job. So other than, yes, the law says you have to keep it for so long because, it's part of some sort of important record that the government will check. Other than that, it's about the business will gain some value out of that record. So they should be involved in this. They should be the drivers of this, and they need to justify why that record. The reason is records managers here and privacy people talking is because we have been charged to kind of help them and manage it on their behalf. But I think organizations still don't understand that it is a business responsibility.
Absolutely. And ongoing program management, right? And Amalia has already, and we both have already talked about this. This is not a one-time check the box. Oh, I have a data, a records inventory. I have a retention schedule. I'm done. No, we highly recommend you get program leadership and ownership of this. The RACI was mentioned earlier, right? Make sure you understand who's responsible for each aspect of this. Make sure you have staffing that's available. I actually would probably do staffing / communication plan tied to this as well, because you have to continually train people. You have to continually make them aware that a records management program is part of your organizational culture. You'll need to understand that you have budget. There will absolutely be an ROI for your organization if you're able to start limiting the amount of information that you have. You'll reduce that, the exposure that your organization may have to possible breaches because you have too much data. So have those in place. Leverage automation, leverage technology so that you can get to a place to where you have a defensible program with a defensible audit trail. So things like policy compliance reminders, having something when you onboard someone in the organization to tell them about your records, information management, and privacy programs. It's imperative that people understand how they manage this and from an organizational standpoint. Anything ongoing, Amalia, you'd like to add to the picture?
Well, somebody did ask this question, but how do you manage that? First of all, you do manage it at the record level, and personal information records are a subcategory of business records. They are part of records. And how do you manage that? Well, when you have to contend with, 15, 20, 200 type laws and retention periods for different kinds of records, in my humble opinion, you can only do it in an automated way. And the automated way is better because it is defensible. It shows that you have a consistent way to maybe not be so right, but you have a consistent approach, and you are monitoring your records and their existence and their justification for being and for producing value.
Yeah, and the how to operationalize this question comes up on the electronic side of it a lot, and I think by understanding what business records can be generated from different data sources or applications that you have, that will allow you to apply safe standard retention requirements to those data sources. And so the example that I like to give a lot is email. Email is something that when it came to litigation, people were going right for it, right? When it comes to a data breach, there's a chance that people could be taking data out and emailing it on, doing things like that, right? So it's a pretty high risk type of data source that's out there. What I've seen a lot of organizations do is determine that the email repository is not the official location for maintaining business records. And then they apply a short retention requirement to records that are in the email, allowing people to move them out of email to another repository that may have a longer retention. But keeping it, like getting it a short period of time within the email environment, has helped save so much risk exposure for organizations. But by doing that, Amalia, do you have other examples, or
I just want to say that that's why a lot of organizations that are contending with these two topics, privacy and records management, they are embarking on an information governance review, a program, because they realize that data has to be usable, has to be accessible, has to be there when we need it, but it has to also comply with the rules and regulations that we have, but it also needs to comply with the records retention schedule and so on. And you can't make sense of that unless you have classification, lineage, all of that, all the good stuff that information governance comes with.
And that's great lead into kind of the last part that we're going to be going through, everybody, is what are those benefits, right? What are the benefits associated with this? And you can get down to specific cost cutting initiatives and reduction in costs. You can get down to the reduction in risk. Like our exposure for this is no longer as high as it used to be, because we don't have all of this personal data that has been determined as rot or sitting out there for so long. And then the efficiencies. I had a client once actually do a study that they determined if they implemented a records retention program, they could save everyone about 5 to 10 minutes a day from searching and trying to find where their information is located. That 5 to 10 minutes a day was extrapolated over the week and then over the year, and then multiplied by the 90,000 employees that they had. And they came up with efficiency costs for their organizations that was close to $5-7 million annually. Now, those are soft, numbers that are out there, but it's a way that they built their business case. So I encourage everyone to think about what's the ROI, what are the cost saving initiatives that you can go through for implementing these programs.
Yeah,
all right.
I agree with you. I think you nailed it. That's it. In the end, how much is going to cost your business if you're looking for a piece of information, or you have to redo it, which happened to me so many times. And then I had to go think, oh, what was I thinking when I was writing this document, and have to rewrite it. And that's just so painful.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and so to close this out, we might have a little bit extra time, but I want to make sure we have a chance to kind of walk through all of this. One of the things that that we're sharing recently is that from a data discovery standpoint, understanding where your data is within certain repositories. If you want to scan that QR code, Xtero is doing a no cost proof of concept associated with data discovery, as we made an announcement of an acquired company yesterday. But then Amalia and I thank you so much for having us on this presentation. I love getting back involved with the ARMA group and really going through this whole process and sharing our visions, sharing our experiences. Hopefully that helps you guys in some of the things that you guys are going through in today's world. But I truly believe that information governance, the records management piece, is so key in that. And if we can keep fighting that fight together, hopefully we'll be heard more and more. Amalia?
You said it so beautifully. I concur.
Sounds good. Well, if you're interested in learning, I think we have another. Then we have our thank you. So here's a thank you. I don't know if there's any chat questions that popped.
I kind of had I did a little bit of answering as you were talking. So awesome. I'm hoping we were able to answer most of the questions, but if we didn't, please address them back to Jennifer, and we will do our best to get back to Jennifer, and she can share the answers with you.
Yes, if you guys have any questions, feel free to stick them in the Q&A box. We can get that pulled out of the system and sent over to Russ and Amalia to answer and distribute with the content to follow up in a couple days. So again, thank you guys so much for attending today. Thank you, Russ and Amalia, for bringing us this great content. I know the discussion in the chat was really lively and great, so we definitely appreciate your time. Everyone keep an eye on your inbox. Like I mentioned, the slides and the recording and your CEU information will come tomorrow, the next day. And we hope to see you on a future ARMA webinar. Keep an eye again on your inbox or check our events calendar to stay up to date with all the future events coming. everyone. We're close to the weekend, so I'll wish everyone a great weekend. And once again, say thank you.
So thank you from us for being such a lovely audience. We had a great time. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.